Hello, I am Christopher Bale from Echoes of Eternity, and in today's video, I will reveal the great truth about Amos, the truth that few know. In the year when the desert winds blew over the valleys of Judah, while the people of Israel surrendered to the illusion of a prosperity that concealed corruption, a simple man walked among the arid hills of Tekoa. His name was Amos, a shepherd of sheep and a cultivator of sycamore trees, far from the corridors of power and oblivious to the intrigues of kings and priests. Nothing in his lineage set him apart, no title rested on his shoulders, and no prophetic school had instructed him. Still, it was upon him that the weight of the Lord's word fell like thunder over the mountains. While he guided his flock under the scorching sun, the voice of the Eternal burst forth in his soul, and he knew that his life would never be the same. The call came without warning, without an angel to announce it, without a visible sign, only the overwhelming certainty that God himself was plucking him from his ordinary life to make him a trumpet of judgment over Israel. Amos's days as a shepherd were numbered, for now he would tend to words as sharp as blades, destined for a hardened people. The Lord revealed visions to him that burned his mind like glowing embers, showing him the sins of a nation that had strayed from the covenant. Israel, swollen with its wealth and strengthened by its military victories, believed itself invulnerable. Its altars were filled with sacrifices. Its religious festivals were abundant, but its justice was like a dried-up river, its promises empty as leaves carried by the wind. The Eternal sent him not to prophesy gentle words, but to raise his voice like a lion roaring in the desert. Amos would be despised, expelled, and accused, but he had no choice, because when God chooses a man, neither the earth nor the sky nor the powerful can silence him. Thus, Amos left Tekoa and headed to the northern kingdom, crossing fertile lands and resplendent cities that testified to Israel's wealth. Yet, under the shine of palaces and the scents of marketplaces, he saw what few dared to see: the deep-rooted corruption in the courts, the poor being sold for a pair of sandals, judges bowing before the gold of the mighty, while the humble were crushed like grains under the millstones. In the markets, merchants deceived with dishonest scales, accumulating riches with unclean hands. In the temples, priests burned incense to idols and proclaimed peace where there was no justice. The people, intoxicated by a superficial faith, believed that rituals would secure the Lord's blessing. But Amos knew the terrible truth: God himself had rejected them. The voice that had called him from the pastures now ignited his soul with sacred indignation. He was not a priest, nor did he possess the eloquence of scribes, but his message did not depend on human artifice. With dusty feet and simple garments, he stood before the multitudes and cried out, "Thus says the Lord, I know your transgressions, and your sins are many. Turn away from evil and seek what is good, so that perhaps the Lord may have mercy on you." But his outcry found hearts as hard as stone. Those who ruled Israel laughed at his words. The nobles despised him, the priests scorned him, the merchants averted their eyes. "Who is this man?" they asked one another. "Where does he come from, with his rough voice and his sunburned face? Who sent him?" But no king had designated him, no prophet had instructed him, and therefore they could not control him. Amos did not need the recognition of men, for he was a bearer of divine judgment. In his visions, God showed him a plumb line over Israel, a tool that measures the straightness of a building, and the voice of the Most High resounded, "Behold, I will set a plumb line in the midst of my people Israel. Never again will I pass by them." The Lord had measured the nation, and it was crooked, irreparable, inclined to collapse. There was no longer any remedy nor return. The time for warnings was over. The time of ruin approached like a storm advancing over the mountains. And while Amos proclaimed the words of the Eternal, few realized that the skies were already heavy, and the thunder of judgment was roaring on the horizon. But the ears of Israel were deaf, and its eyes blind. The princes feasted on beds of ivory, drinking wine from golden cups, while the poor withered at the doors of their houses. At the tops of the mountains, the priests offered sacrifices, but their hands were stained with the blood of injustice. The noble women clamored for more perfumes and jewels, unaware that decay was already consuming the nation's foundations. Amos looked upon all this and knew that judgment would not be delayed. Then God showed him another vision, a basket of ripe fruits, a symbol that Israel's time had run out. Just as fruits, when they reach their fullness, soon begin to rot, so too was the nation ready for the harvest of judgment. The end has come upon my people Israel. Never again will I pass by them, said the Lord. The sentence was sealed. There would be no more postponement nor forgiveness. The day would come like a sharp blade, and none would escape. The songs of the temple would turn to weeping. The laughter in the palaces would become cries of despair. The sun would set at noon, and darkness would cover the land in broad daylight. And so Amos continued his mission, proclaiming the imminent ruin, while the leaders of Israel schemed against him. It was then that Amazias, the priest of Bethel, became aware of the prophet's words and felt affronted. Bethel, where a royal sanctuary had been erected, was the center of worship in the northern kingdom. There, the priests served the king, not God. To Amazias, Amos was nothing more than a troublemaker, a foreigner from Judah coming to sow fear among the people. Enraged, he sent a message to King Jeroboam, denouncing that the prophet was conspiring against him. "The land cannot bear all your words," wrote the priest. And then, turning to Amos, he ordered, "Go, seer, return to your land. Prophesy in Judah and do not return to Bethel, for here is the king's sanctuary and the house of the kingdom." But Amos did not bow to human authority. He had nothing to lose. "I am not a prophet, nor the son of a prophet," he replied. "I am a shepherd of sheep and a cultivator of sycamore trees. But the Lord took me and commanded me, 'Go and prophesy to my people Israel.'" And because Amazias dared to reject the word of the Lord, a curse fell upon his house. His offspring would perish, his wife would become a prostitute in the streets, and he would die in a foreign land. For no one, neither priest nor king, could prevent the word of the Most High from being fulfilled. Amos's words resonated like a blow upon Israel, yet the people remained indifferent. The threats of destruction seemed distant too. Those who took refuge in their palaces, surrounded by walls and armies. But God, who weighs the nations on the scales of justice, had already determined the day of judgment. Amos saw in a vision the day of the Lord, and that which Israel expected to be a day of triumph became a harbinger of horror. "Woe to you who desire the day of the Lord," cried the prophet. "What good will that day do you? It will be a day of darkness, not light." God's judgment would spare no one. There would be no escape, for it would be like a man fleeing from a lion and falling into the claws of a bear, or who, upon entering a house seeking refuge, is bitten by a hidden serpent. Israel's securities were illusory, its fortresses as fragile as clay before the storm. The Lord rejected their sacrifices and their solemn festivals, for there was no justice in their hands. He demanded something that Israel was unwilling to offer. Rather, let judgment run like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. But the rivers of righteousness had dried up, and the only deluge that remained was that of divine wrath. Thus, the Lord not only judged Israel, but extended his sentence to the neighboring nations. Standing as a witness before the divine tribunal, Amos heard the Most High's proclamation against Damascus, Gaza, Tyre, Edom, Ammon, and Moab. No nation was above God's judgment. The sword would turn against those who had oppressed the defenseless, crushed the weak, and betrayed sacred alliances. The kingdoms that had trusted in their own strength would be swept away like dust in the wind. But for Israel, which had received the law and the covenant, the weight of judgment was even greater. Only you I have known of all the families of the earth, said the Lord. Therefore I will punish you for all your iniquities. The privilege of being chosen by God did not exempt them from divine discipline. On the contrary, it made the punishment more certain and severe. Israel's arrogance, its hardened heart, its confidence in riches and empty rituals would be its downfall. And Amos, the shepherd called from the hills of Tekoa, had become the harbinger of this imminent destruction. Then the Lord showed Amos another vision, a foretaste of the final judgment on Israel. The prophet saw the Lord beside the altar, and his voice thundered like an unappealable decree. Strike the capital, and let the thresholds tremble. I will cast them down upon the heads of all, and I will kill the remnant by the sword. None will flee, none will escape. It was the end of Israel's false security. Neither the temples, nor the mountains, nor the hidden caves would shelter the guilty from the Lord's wrath. If they ascended to the heavens, he would bring them down. If they descended to the deepest abyss, there his hand would reach them. If they sought refuge on Mount Carmel's summit, he would search for them. If they tried to escape in the depths of the sea, he would send the Leviathan to devour them. For he is the Lord of hosts, the one who touches the earth and it melts, the one who calls the waters of the sea and pours them upon the face of the earth. And whom did Israel think it could deceive? Whom did it seek to fool with its empty sacrifices? Was it not the same God who had brought its fathers out of Egypt? But now, as a rebellious nation, they would be scattered like chaff in the wind. Israel, who saw itself as the chosen people, would hear the bitter verdict. Are you not for me as the children of the Ethiopians, O children of Israel? Have I not brought Israel up from the land of Egypt, and the Philistines from Kaphtor, and the Syrians from Kir? The Lord was not bound to a single nation, for the whole earth belonged to him, and he would render justice impartially. And then the Lord revealed to Amos the devastation that was to come. The fields would be laid waste, the vineyards dried up, the stone houses empty and in ruins. There would be famine, but not a famine for bread, thirst, but not for water. God himself would withdraw his word from among them, and the people would wander from one sea to another, from the north to the east, seeking to hear something from the Lord, but they would find nothing but silence. He who once cried out and was not heard would now hear silence as his answer. The young would faint from thirst, the maidens and the strong men would fall, and those who swore by the name of false gods would perish along with their empty promises. Destruction would come swiftly, like a whirlwind over the hills, and the invading armies, like a swarm of locusts, would consume the land. Israel, which had despised correction and rejected the prophets, would fall with no one to raise it up. For the patience of the Lord has its limit, and the time of mercy had run out. Then came the day when the Lord's wrath ceased to be mere words on the prophet's lips and became reality. The walls of Samaria, once symbols of security and power, trembled before the advance of an implacable army. The sound of war trumpets echoed through the valleys, and the dust raised by the invaders darkened the skies. The enemy did not come by chance, nor by its own desire, but was raised by God himself as an instrument of judgment. Israel's warriors were slain at the city gates, the merchants saw their treasures plundered, and the nobles who once feasted at tables of ivory were led away in chains, humiliated like slaves. Weeping filled the streets. Mothers cried for their dead sons, and the priests of Bethel saw their altars toppled, their images shattered, and their robes covered in ashes. He who trusted in his wealth lost everything. He who trusted in false gods found himself abandoned. What Amos had prophesied was fulfilled without fail, for the word of the Lord never returns empty. Yet in the midst of chaos and destruction, a remnant remained. For God, even as he executed judgment, never completely erased his promise. Amos, who had proclaimed the fall of Israel, also had a vision of hope. The Lord declared that after the devastation, one day he would restore David's fallen tent. He would gather the exiles, bring back the dispersed, and rebuild what had been destroyed. The fields would bloom again, the vineyards would bear fruit once more, and the justice that had been like a dried-up river would become an ever-flowing spring. The ruins would rise again, not by the strength of men, but by the power of the God who wounds and heals, who destroys and restores. Israel would be purified by the fire of affliction, but it would not cease to exist. For the Lord is just in his judgment, yet faithful in his mercy. And so the lands of Israel, once filled with arrogance and falsehood, became a desert of ashes and memories. The cities were empty. The vineyards that once bore fruit now became tombs of a people who refused to heed the voice of the Most High. The caravans that once traveled its roads, bringing gold and spices, now turned away from its ruins, for nothing remained there but rubble and dust carried by the wind. Those who once mocked Amos were now scattered, taken captive to foreign lands, without a home, without an altar, without a name. That which was built in pride fell into humiliation. The justice of God had been fulfilled, and Israel, which thought itself untouchable, tasted the bitter cup of divine wrath. For when God measures a nation with the plumb line of his holiness, nothing crooked can stand. Yet the word of the Lord was not only destruction, but promise. For Amos, who had been taken from the pastures to proclaim judgment, also announced a future restoration, a day when the Lord would rebuild that which had been torn down. The destroyed cities would be inhabited again, the abandoned fields would yield produce once more, and the exiles would return, like children coming back home after a long journey. And on that day, the Lord would not only restore Israel, but extend his blessing to all nations. For the faithful remnant would not be forgotten, and the covenant made with the ancestors would never be annulled. The God who weighs sins is the same who raises the fallen, and his justice walks hand in hand with his mercy. But the promise did not mean that everything would remain as before. The judgment was a turning point, a separation between those who listened and those who rejected the voice of the Lord. The land had been cleansed by the fire of divine wrath, and only those who feared the name of the Most High would return to dwell in it. For the Lord would not restore Israel so that it might repeat its former sins, but so that it would become a people of justice and righteousness. I will plant them in their land, said the Lord, and they will never be plucked out again. But this new Israel would not be merely a nation of men, but a people molded by obedience and reverence for God. There would be no more place for oppressors who exploit the poor, nor for priests who sacrifice without heart. The Lord would build something new, an unshakable kingdom, where justice would not be mere rhetoric, but a river that flows unceasingly. And so the words of Amos, the shepherd of Tekoa, would echo through the generations. For he did not prophesy only for his time, but for all who would come after. His voice did not fall silent with the destruction of Israel, nor was it lost in the silence of exile. It remains as a warning to every nation that trusts in its prosperity while ignoring justice, to every people that celebrates empty rights while oppressing the defenseless, to every heart that resists the voice of God. For the history of Israel is the history of all humanity, a people that forgets its Creator and reaps the consequences, but in the severity of judgment discovers that God is still faithful. For he brings down the proud, but lifts up the humble. He destroys what is corrupt, but preserves those who turn to him in repentance. And so, the story of Amos ends like a thunderclap echoing beyond the mountains of Judah. He did not seek glory, nor did he desire to become a herald of judgment, but was chosen by God himself to proclaim what many feared to hear. He was despised by the powerful, ridiculed by the priests, ignored by the people. Yet time proved that his words were not mere empty warnings. They were the truth of the living God, echoing through the centuries. What he saw, what he proclaimed, was fulfilled with terrible precision. Samaria fell, Israel was scattered, and the great silence that God decreed over the land endured. But his voice, inscribed in the scriptures, continues to speak, for his message was not only for a kingdom that no longer exists, but for all who believe they can live without fear of the Lord, and who today will heed his words, who will open their eyes before the plumb line of judgment is set upon the nations once again. For the days pass, kingdoms rise and fall, but the God who called Amos from among the shepherds remains the same. He watches over the peoples, weighs their hearts, sees the arrogance of those who consider themselves untouchable, and the misery of those forgotten by men. The time of patience does not last forever. The day will come when the nations are measured, and the Lord will decide who remains and who will be swept from the earth. Those who rely on their own strength will fall. Those who seek refuge in the eternal will live. Thus the account of Amos concludes, yet his voice never grows silent. For the God who spoke through the shepherd of Tekoa still speaks. His eyes scan the land, his hands hold the scales of justice, and his judgment is certain. Blessed are those who listen before it is too late, for when the plumb line is set, there is no return.